The aprons moved like surrendered banners in the wind, each one flapping against the wire fence as if trying to break free. Beyond them, the Texas sky stretched so wide it could swallow a person whole. Dust swirled under the guard tower where a soldier leaned lazily against his rifle, watching the newest arrivals. The women stood in two tight lines, their white kerchiefs already dulled by the crossing of the Atlantic, their faces set in careful masks that betrayed nothing. They were nurses of the German Red Cross, plucked from battlefields and field hospitals, now prisoners on foreign soil. Greta kept her chin level, though every bone in her body wanted to tremble. She had seen too much to give them the satisfaction of seeing her small. In France, she had worked under shellfire, her apron stiff with blood by nightfall. She had stitched boys together under candlelight, soothed the dying with songs they no longer had breath to finish. And now this. America, land of the enemy. She expected shouting, humiliation, a strip search that would grind the last dignity out of them. Instead, a colonel approached with a clipboard and a strange softness in his voice. "Ladies," he said, tipping his cap. "Welcome." The word stung more than any curse. "Welcome." Greta blinked. The colonel's boots were polished, his uniform pressed so crisp it almost shone. He could have been greeting nurses at a Sunday church social, not processing enemy captives. He went down the line, checking names, asking each if she was well. The questions were simple, almost absurd. "Are you hungry? Are you injured?" He sounded genuinely interested in the answers. They were marched into the camp, not prodded but guided. The air smelled of mesquite and cattle. There were barracks, yes, and barbed wire, but also neat gravel paths, a vegetable garden, even a row of laundry posts strung with rope. It looked less like a prison, and more like some orderly frontier village with guard towers. Greta felt the women beside her relax a fraction, though none dared speak. Inside the barracks, cots were lined in perfect symmetry. Clean sheets. Pillows. There was soap at the basin, real soap that smelled faintly of pine. Greta ran a hand over the cloth like someone testing if it was real. She thought of Cologne, the rubble, the children crying under stone. This felt like a cruel trick, too gentle to trust. The first meal was the next shock. Coffee. Real coffee, dark and strong. Bread that was still warm, butter melting into its surface. Meat stew rich enough to make her eyes sting. The women ate without speaking, as if they were thieves at a feast. When the American cook saw their hesitation, he smiled and said, "Don't worry, Fräuleins. There's plenty." Greta could not stop staring at the man's face. He had freckles, laugh lines, eyes like the clear summer sky outside. In another life, he could have been her neighbor. She swallowed hard and forced her gaze back to her bowl. The days took on rhythm. At dawn, the bugle sounded, and they rose, plaited their hair, tied on their aprons. They marched to the infirmary, where German prisoners lay on cots. Boys from the Africa Corps, men frostbitten from Russia. One officer missing an arm, but still managing a crooked smile when Greta changed his bandages. Here, she found a strange kind of freedom. No shells, no screaming trains of the wounded, no running from air raids. Only the steady work of healing. The American doctors treated the women like colleagues. They discussed cases over clipboards, nodding at their advice. When Greta suggested a poultice for a wound that was turning sour, the doctor simply said, "Good idea. Let's do it." No one barked orders or insulted her accent. For the first time in years, her work felt purely about saving lives, not about feeding a war machine. Yet the wire was always there, humming in the wind. Guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles slung across their shoulders. At night, Greta lay awake listening to the crunch of boots outside and the far-off bark of coyotes. Freedom was only a few yards away, but unreachable. The locals were less welcoming. Sometimes, on laundry day, farmers slowed their trucks to stare. One spat in the dirt and drove off, muttering. The town newspaper printed a column complaining that the enemy women were allowed to sunbathe in the yard. Greta and the others laughed when they read it, though their laughter sounded strange, brittle. They had tended to men whose faces were half gone from shrapnel, and here they were being criticized for lying in the sun. Still, the camp was not without tension. A girl named Lotte tried to climb the fence one night. They found her tangled in the wire, weeping, her hands cut and bleeding. She was not punished, just treated, bandaged, and returned to her cot. The colonel spoke to them the next morning, his voice quiet but firm. "No one is here to harm you," he said. "But you must stay inside. The war is not over yet." Greta watched him carefully, searching for malice, but there was none. He looked tired, perhaps even sad. She wondered if he had daughters of his own. Weeks passed, and the sharp edges of fear dulled into something like routine. Greta found herself humming as she worked, humming even when she peeled potatoes with the other women. One evening, after the day's duties were done, she stepped outside and saw the sky awash with gold, the kind of light that seemed to set the entire prairie on fire. For a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. And yet, beneath that light, the wire glinted. The colonel walked past, his hat in his hand, and for an instant their eyes met. She looked away quickly, heart thudding. Something was changing, inside her, inside all of them. They had expected humiliation. They had found courtesy, maybe even respect. And respect was far more dangerous. Because respect could undo a person. It could make her question who the enemy really was. Greta lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her hands clenched in the blanket. Somewhere beyond the wire, the war still thundered, but here, in this unlikely corner of Texas, something more disquieting was happening. She was beginning to feel human again. And that frightened her more than anything. Winter came to Texas with a whisper, not the biting snowstorms of Europe, but a dry wind that rattled the tin roofs and carried the smell of wood smoke from the mess hall. Greta found herself lingering near the window more often, drawn to the sight of guards walking their perimeter rounds, boots crunching softly on frosted earth. Life inside the camp had grown eerily calm. Too calm, perhaps. The nurses no longer flinched when the searchlights swept across the yard. Some of them had even started laughing again, genuine laughter that rolled out of the barracks like music, startling the guards into shy grins. It was a dangerous thing, this comfort, and Greta knew it. Comfort could make a prisoner forget the shape of her chains. One morning, the colonel came to the infirmary himself. His presence was so rare that conversation froze mid-sentence. He carried his hat under one arm, the cold drawing color into his face. "We'd like your help," he said to Greta, as though she had a choice. A truck of new prisoners had arrived, men wounded on the front, their fevers climbing, their limbs blackened with frostbite. The American medics needed every hand. Greta nodded without thinking, instinct pushing past fear. Within the hour she was standing beside an American doctor, sleeves rolled, sweat prickling at her hairline as they worked side by side. What struck her most was how natural it felt. No shouting, no suspicion. When she suggested a treatment, the doctor listened. When she asked for more bandages, he passed them without hesitation. For hours they worked, saving fingers where they could, amputating where they had no choice. At one point, the colonel himself appeared in the doorway, silent, watching. His gaze was not one of command, but of something closer to trust. Greta felt it like a weight. Later that week, something extraordinary happened. The colonel invited the nurses to dine with the officers for Christmas Eve. There was a ripple of unease through the barracks when the announcement was made. It felt improper, almost dangerous, to sit at the same table as their captors. But when the night came, they dressed carefully, aprons starched, hair braided, as though going to a feast in a ruined world. The mess hall glowed with lantern light. A small pine tree stood in the corner, strung with paper stars and lengths of cotton to mimic snow. Greta felt her chest tighten at the sight of it. The colonel stood and offered a few words about peace, about the duty to remember humanity, even in war. Then he surprised them all by asking the nurses to sing. Their voices rose, hesitant at first, then fuller, weaving together in the familiar chords of Still Nacht. The room changed with the sound. Guards stood straighter, spoons frozen halfway to mouths. Even the colonel bowed his head. Greta sang until her throat ached, the words tasting like home, like candlelight on winter windows. When the final note faded, no one spoke for a long time. That night, lying awake, Greta felt something shift inside her. She had come to this camp prepared to endure hatred, to harden herself against insult. Instead, she had been given dignity. And dignity was a more difficult prison than barbed wire. It made her wonder whether the enemy she had been taught to despise was truly an enemy at all, or simply men doing their duty as she had done hers. But there were still reminders that this was captivity, not sanctuary. One afternoon, an American guard stumbled over his broken German, trying to tell a joke to the nurses, and they laughed so hard that the camp commander had to step outside to hide his own grin. The moment was light, almost absurd, but when Greta turned back to the fence, its shadow stretched long over the yard, reminding her that freedom was still on the other side. The weeks that followed blurred into a strange peace. Some of the women began keeping journals. Others wrote letters home, careful with their words so as not to anger the censors. Greta found herself watching the colonel whenever he visited the infirmary. There was a quiet in him that matched her own. He never smiled too broadly, never spoke too loudly, but there was a steadiness in his gaze that unsettled her. It was the look of a man who believed in fairness even when the world was falling apart. One rainy evening, a transport of prisoners was moved out under cover of darkness. Greta stood at the window and watched the trucks roll away, their taillights vanishing into the mist. She wondered what waited for them beyond the wire. More war, more hunger, or perhaps a home that no longer existed. The thought struck her hard. When this was all over, would she even recognize her own life? Or had this strange, fenced-in place become the truest version of it? It was near spring when the moment came that would stay with her forever. The colonel called the nurses together in the yard. The air was warm, smelling faintly of rain, the soil dark and soft underfoot. "Ladies," he said, "the war is nearing its end. Soon, you will be sent home." There was a murmur among the women, relief, fear, something in between. Greta felt her heart hammering, not with joy, but with a sudden, inexplicable grief. The colonel paused, as though measuring his next words carefully. "I want you to remember that you were treated here not as prisoners, but as nurses. You served with honor. You saved lives." He looked at them, one by one, as if memorizing their faces. Greta felt her throat tighten until she could hardly breathe. When he finished speaking, the women turned silently back to their barracks. No one spoke for a long time. Greta sat on her cot, staring at her hands, still smelling faintly of antiseptic from the day's work. She realized that the barbed wire no longer felt like a wall to her. It felt like a line drawn through the war itself, a thin, glittering thread holding back the madness outside. That night, as the guards' boots crunched softly in the distance, Greta finally let herself cry. She cried for the boys she had patched together in France, for the cities reduced to dust, for the girl she had been before the world turned to fire. And when she was done, she lay very still, listening to the quiet hum of the camp. Somewhere out there, the war was ending. Somewhere out there, her life was waiting. But here, for one last night, she was caught between two worlds, and the thought of leaving felt as terrifying as it did miraculous.